In every age, there are minds that do not simply think they see. They see through illusions so thick that ordinary eyes mistake them for reality. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of those rare minds, a man who looked at life and found not beauty first, but suffering. He believed that the core of existence is will, an endless, restless striving that torments every living being. To him, genius was not the gift of happiness, but the curse of seeing too much, the unbearable clarity of mind that cannot unsee the chaos beneath order, the pain beneath pleasure. And yet, in our modern world, another philosopher, Byung-Chul, has awakened a similar awareness, but in a new form. Han speaks of the burnout society, an era where suffering no longer comes from external oppression, but from internal exhaustion, where people, enslaved not by others but by their own need to perform, to produce, to shine, destroy themselves in the name of achievement. Schopenhauer's world was one of metaphysical torment. Han's world is one of psychological fatigue. But both speak of the same human tragedy, the suffering of consciousness itself. And from that suffering, the genius is born. The genius, for both thinkers, is not the one who knows more, but the one who feels more deeply. He sees through the veil of social noise. He stands alone in his perception, and that isolation, that painful distance from the crowd, becomes both his prison and his power. So today, let us step inside the psychology of a genius, not the Hollywood myth of the charming intellect or the flamboyant innovator, but the real genius and the one who walks alone in thought, tormented by what he perceives, yet illuminated by what others cannot grasp. This is the mind of Schopenhauer. This is the modern mirror of Byung-Chul. And together they reveal what genius truly costs, and why most people would never dare to pay the price. Part 1. The weight of perception. To understand the psychology of a genius, we must begin not with intelligence but with perception. Schopenhauer believed that what separates the genius from the average person is not what he knows, but how he sees. Most people, he wrote, see the world only as it serves their will, through desire, through utility, through need. But the genius is able to step outside this prison of wanting. He sees the world objectively, purely, almost painfully as it is. For a brief moment, the genius ceases to be an individual striving for something. He becomes a pure mirror, reflecting existence without purpose, without judgment, without comfort. This, Schopenhauer said, is the origin of all great art and philosophy, moments when the will is silenced and the intellect reigns alone. But this silence is not peaceful. It is overwhelming. For in that stillness, the genius sees the futility of everything, the endless repetition of desire, the cruelty of nature, the absurdity of human ambition. The ordinary person can escape this realization through distraction, through work, through pleasure, through noise. But the genius cannot. He feels too much, thinks too deeply, and therefore suffers endlessly. Byung-Chul, observing the modern human, might say that this sensitivity still exists. But today it is drowned by hyperactivity. The modern mind cannot rest, not because it is oppressed, but because it is addicted to stimulation. We are no longer beaten into submission by external masters. We are seduced into self-destruction by internal demands. Han calls this the achievement. Subject the modern self that believes freedom means constant productivity. We no longer live under the whip of others, but under the whip of ourselves. In this sense, the genius, the one who still pauses, who still observes, who still dares to be still, becomes a revolutionary. He refuses the acceleration of the world. He rejects the cult of performance. He returns to what Schopenhauer called the pure subject of knowledge, a consciousness that looks without wanting. But in doing so, he becomes alien to everyone else. He belongs nowhere. Because in a world that worships speed, silence looks like madness. Thus, the first mark of genius is not brilliance, it is alienation. The genius stands at the edge of human experience, watching, understanding, yet unable to join. He carries the unbearable gift of perception, to see through illusions that others call happiness. Part 2. The suffering of clarity. Schopenhauer wrote that life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. Pain when our desires are unsatisfied, boredom when they are fulfilled, and in between those swings the genius finds no rest. For even when he achieves, he sees the emptiness that follows achievement. Even when he rests, he feels the weight of existence pressing upon his mind. He is cursed with awareness, too intelligent to be content, too conscious to be deceived. Byung-Chul Han echoes this in modern terms. He says we live in an age of positive violence, a violence not of repression, but of excess. We overproduce, overcommunicate, overachieve, and in doing so, we destroy our souls quietly, efficiently, willingly. We call it freedom, but it is another form of slavery, the slavery of self-optimization. In this new digital landscape, the genius becomes an endangered species. For genius requires solitude. It needs distance from noise. It grows in the soil of silence. But our world leaves no space for that kind of stillness. The modern genius, then, suffers not from being misunderstood, but from being constantly interrupted. He is surrounded by distraction disguised as connection, by performance disguised as progress. The world no longer fears deep thinkers. It ignores them. And that indifference is worse than hostility. Schopenhauer would have recognized this as another mask of the will to appear, to be seen to matter. Han calls it the transparency society, where everything must be visible, shareable, liked. But the genius thrives in the invisible. He creates not to be admired, but to express something he cannot bear to keep inside. And so while the crowd seeks validation, the genius seeks meaning. While others chase applause, he searches for truth, even when that truth destroys his peace. In both Schopenhauer and Han, genius is inseparable from pain. It is not a trait to be envied, but a burden to be endured. The genius suffers not because he is weak, but because he perceives too clearly. He looks at a world that keeps running and he sees, beneath all motion, the same ancient stillness of suffering. And yet, it is from this suffering that art, insight, and beauty emerge. Because only the one who sees darkness can recognize light when it appears. Only the one who suffers deeply can speak truthfully about the human condition. And that tragic depth is the real psychology of a genius. Part 3. The solitude of depth. Every true genius walks alone, not because he hates the world, but because the world cannot follow him. Schopenhauer said that solitude is the fate of all superior minds. He compared the genius to a high mountain peak, beautiful from afar, but desolate at its summit. Few can breathe that air, and fewer still can survive in it. For the higher the mind climbs, the thinner the atmosphere becomes. At the height of thought, there is silence, and that silence, for most people, feels unbearable. But for the genius, it is necessary. Solitude is not isolation. It is the sanctuary of clarity. In solitude, the mind no longer plays the social game of pretending. There are no masks to wear, no applause to chase, no mirrors to impress. There is only reality, naked, indifferent, eternal. Schopenhauer called it the great mirror of the world, and he believed that only in the stillness of solitude could one see it clearly. The crowd hides from itself through noise. The genius confronts himself through silence. Byung-Chul Han warns that our modern culture is allergic to that silence. He says we live in a society of transparency, where every thought must be shared, every emotion displayed, every moment exposed. Solitude has become suspicious when we call it loneliness, depression, even failure. But Han insists that true contemplation can only exist in distance, when one is free from the constant gaze of others. In his words, the crowd is the new form of hell, not because it torments you, but because it never leaves you alone. The genius then becomes an act of rebellion. He resists the compulsion to be visible. He withdraws not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. He understands that to think deeply, one must first disappear. To create, one must die, symbolically to the noise of the world. For genius is not born from communication. It is born from confrontation. A confrontation with the self, with suffering, with truth. And so, the solitude of the genius is not a wound. It is a discipline. It is the furnace in which wisdom is purified. It is the stillness in which the eternal whispers are finally heard. It is the dark soil from which the flower of insight grows. Unseen, uncelebrated yet immortal, Part 4. The Rebellion Against the Will. In Schopenhauer's universe, the world is driven by an invisible force, the will. It is blind, endless, irrational. It pushes every being to strive, to desire, to chase what can never satisfy it. We work, we love, we hunger, and when we get what we want, the will only moves the goal further away. It is a cosmic treadmill of suffering. To Schopenhauer, the only escape is the denial of the will, the moment when the mind sees through the illusion of desire and stops running. This, he said, is the highest form of wisdom, to know that nothing we seek can free us, except the act of ceasing to seek. Byung-Chul sees this same dynamic at play in the modern self. He says the contemporary individual has not overcome the will, he has simply internalized it. We no longer need masters because we have become our own. We whip ourselves into productivity. We exploit our own energy, our own attention, our own souls. We are, as Han writes, entrepreneurs of ourselves. We have taken the ancient will to live and transformed it into the modern will to perform. The genius, however, refuses this self-enslavement. He does not chase success. He chases understanding. He does not measure his worth by outcomes, but by insight. He lives not by the rhythm of schedules, but by the pulse of contemplation. In a world that worships busyness, he becomes the heretic of stillness. His rebellion is quiet, but profound. He does not fight the will by force. He transcends it through awareness. Schopenhauer called this transcendence the aesthetic state, a condition where the mind, absorbed in beauty or truth, forgets the self entirely. When a composer writes, when a painter loses himself in color, when a philosopher stares into eternity, the will falls silent. For that brief eternity, the world is no longer a battlefield of desires, but a mirror of pure being. And in that silence, the genius feels a strange peace of not happiness but release. Han's language mirrors this. He calls for contemplative time, the lost art of dwelling, not scrolling, not producing but being. He says the world reveals itself only to those who dwell in it. And the genius, by withdrawing from the marketplace of attention, becomes the last dweller in an age of acceleration. He does not run after meaning. He waits for it, patiently, courageously, endlessly. This rebellion against the will is not an act of escape, but of awakening. The genius does not reject the world. He simply refuses to be ruled by it. He watches it spin, he feels its pain, he endures its absurdity, and yet he remains still. That stillness is his power. It is his freedom. It is his quiet victory over the chaos of existence. Part 5. The Gift and the Curse. To call someone a genius is to praise them. But Schopenhauer and Han remind us that genius is rarely a blessing. It is more often a wound that bleeds brilliance. The genius does not live lightly. He feels every vibration of the world, every tremor of suffering, every echo of futility. He cannot escape awareness. He cannot forget what others are able to ignore. He lives in a state of heightened perception, and that, over time, becomes unbearable. Schopenhauer described genius as a magnifying glass of consciousness. Everything that passes through it burns more intensely: joy, pain, hope, despair. The genius sees not just the surface of things, but the abyss beneath them, and yet it is this very sensitivity that allows him to create. Because what others call madness, he calls perception. What others flee from, he transforms into art. Byung-Chul. Han might say that this intensity is incompatible with our current culture. Our age celebrates brightness but fears depth. We admire the glow of intelligence but cannot endure its darkness. We want creativity without suffering, wisdom without solitude, genius without madness. But such a thing cannot exist. For true genius is not about success. It is about seeing truth, regardless of the cost. Han warns that the modern psyche is collapsing not from repression, but from overexposure, from the constant pressure to express, to perform, to shine. The genius, in contrast, values mystery. He protects his inner world from overexposure. He knows that what is sacred dies when displayed. In a society obsessed with light, he chooses shadow. In a culture that never stops talking, he chooses silence. This is his gift and his curse. He carries within him both the burden of understanding and the beauty of creation. He suffers not for the sake of suffering, but because he cannot close his eyes. And yet, through that pain, he gives the world what it cannot give itself, the mirror of truth. The genius, then, is not above humanity. He is its wound made visible, its pain made articulate. He is the reminder that consciousness is both a miracle and a tragedy, that to see clearly is to suffer deeply but also to love deeply, for out of that suffering emerges compassion, art, and wisdom, the very things that make life bearable. And so, as Schopenhauer and Hahn silently agree across centuries, the psychology of a genius is not found in intellect alone. It is found in the courage to feel, to endure, and to remain awake in a world that dreams of ignorance. Part 6. The Mirror of Suffering. To understand the genius, one must understand suffering, not as an accident of life, but as its very structure. Schopenhauer believed that suffering is not something that happens to us. It is what we are. The will that drives existence also ensures its torment. Every act of desire is a declaration of lack. Every hope is a confession of emptiness. And yet, through this endless storm of longing, the genius does not seek escape, he seeks meaning. He sees in suffering not merely pain but revelation. For when everything falls apart, when pleasure loses its charm and achievement its glow, what remains is the raw truth of existence itself. Schopenhauer said, "It is only through suffering that we come to knowledge." The genius lives by this. He does not run from suffering. He observes it, studies it, listens to it until it reveals its hidden wisdom. Byung-Chul Han extends this insight into the modern world. He writes that our age has become allergic to pain. We sterilize it, medicate it, distract ourselves from it with endless digital noise. We confuse comfort with happiness, speed with meaning, and stimulation with life. But Han warns, a society that cannot suffer cannot think. Because thought, real thought, begins where comfort ends. For the genius, suffering is not an enemy. It is the mirror in which he sees the depth of life. It strips away illusions, burns away pretense, and exposes the essence of being. In that exposure lies creativity. For every profound idea, every timeless artwork, every great insight, is born from pain transfigured into understanding. The genius transforms agony into architecture. He takes despair and shapes it into form. What others avoid, he embraces. What others bury, he resurrects. Hahn would call this the art of negativity. He argues that modern culture has lost the ability to say no, to withdraw, to resist, to negate. Everything must be positive, productive, visible, and efficient. But genius requires negativity, the sacred space where creation emerges from what is broken. Just as silence makes music possible, suffering makes wisdom possible. And the genius, unlike the masses, does not fear this darkness. He calls it home. Thus, the psychology of genius is inseparable from the psychology of suffering. It is not about escaping the human condition, but embracing it so deeply that it transforms. The genius does not rise above pain. He descends into it, and there in the depths, he finds a truth the surface could never hold. He learns that to suffer consciously is to awaken, and in that awakening, he becomes the mirror of humanity, reflecting both its despair and its possibility. Part 7. The Awakening of Being. If suffering is the shadow of genius, awakening is its light. After the long descent into solitude, rebellion, and pain, the genius emerges not broken, but illuminated. He does not find happiness, for happiness was never his pursuit. He finds something rarer, purer, and more enduring when understanding. Schopenhauer called this state the negation of the will to live. But it is not death, it is liberation. It is the moment when the self no longer identifies with its desires, when consciousness becomes detached from the wheel of craving and fear. In this quiet transcendence, the genius sees life not as tragedy or comedy, but as a cosmic artwork, vast, senseless, and beautiful precisely because it is free of purpose. The genius no longer fights the chaos. He watches it serenely as a witness of eternity. Byung-Chul Han describes a similar awakening for the modern soul. He says that only through contemplation, not activity, can we recover our lost being. In stillness, the self ceases to be a project and becomes a presence. We stop managing life and start living it. The genius then becomes a teacher not through instruction, but through example, by showing that one can exist without constant validation, without noise, without performance. Han calls this the art of dwelling. It is the art of remaining, but in pain, in thought, in silence, until meaning arises on its own. The genius dwells where others flee. He waits where others rush. He listens where others speak. And because of this, He sees what others cannot, the secret harmony between being and nothingness, between chaos and creation. This awakening is not a mystical miracle. It is the slow unfolding of awareness. It comes when the mind stops asking, "What do I want?" and begins asking, "What is?" In that question, all desire dissolves. The genius no longer acts to achieve, he acts to express. He no longer creates for recognition. He creates because creation itself is his way of existing truthfully. And here at last Schopenhauer and Hahn meet in silence. One speaks from the 19th century of the futility of desire, the other from the 21st of the exhaustion of performance. But both reveal the same truth, that freedom begins where compulsion ends, that peace begins where striving stops, that genius is not the conquest of life but its comprehension. Ending. The legacy of the genius mind. The genius is not remembered because he was admired. He is remembered because he understood. While others chased comfort, he chased truth. While others drowned in distraction, he endured solitude. While others avoided pain, he made art from it. And in doing so, he left behind something that will never fade, a glimpse into what it means to be fully awake in a sleeping world. Schopenhauer taught that life is suffering, but through understanding, we can transcend it. Byung-Chul Han reminds us that even in the age of screens and noise, stillness remains the last sanctuary of the soul. Between them lies a bridge cut from the metaphysical, despair of the 19th century, to the digital, fatigue of the 21st. And across that bridge walks the genius carrying the torch of awareness through the darkness of time. To be a genius, then, is not to be superior. It is to be sensitive. It is to see the threads of reality that others ignore, and to bear their weight without breaking. It is to turn one's suffering into vision, one's loneliness into truth, and one's silence into creation. It is to live in the tension between despair and beauty, and to call that tension life. So the next time you think of genius, do not imagine power, fame, or intellect. Imagine a quiet figure alone, thinking, suffering, understanding. Someone who saw too much, felt too deeply, and yet continued to create. Because genius is not the light that blinds. It is the light that survives the darkness. As Schopenhauer would say, the person who has once recognized the world's wretchedness and emptiness is cured forever of striving after its pleasures. And as Hahn might add, in a world where everyone performs, true freedom is to rest. The genius rests, not because he is weary, but because he has finally understood. And in that understanding, he becomes eternal. Long pause, fading ambient music, soft wind, philosophical resonance. The psychology of a genius, Schopenhauer and Byung-Chul Han. The mind that suffers, and the soul that sees.